Hi everyone, welcome back to Calyx Cafe. I'm a firm believer that there should be more standardization in the clinical trials industry. So I'm looking forward to my next interview with Tania Snioch from GS1. She's Director of Healthcare Operations and she's been leading an initiative to standardize barcodes that we put on our drug kits. I'll be interested to hear from her how they got to where they are now, but also what type of challenges they've faced along the way. I'll see you in a bit. I'm with Tania at Calyx Cafe. Hi Tania, how are you doing?
Hi, great to have some time with you.
Well, thank you for joining us. So I know it's quite late in the day for you. Do you have a hot drink still at this time of day?
Unfortunately, I always have a hot drink with me, or fortunately. This time I've just got a plain black tea, Irish breakfast tea, nothing exciting.
Well, it doesn't matter as long as it does the job.
That's exactly right. Too true.
So you are working for GS1, but I don't know if our audience knows you. So would you like to tell us a bit more about yourself and how you got involved in the clinical trials industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So the very quick background is I studied biomedical science at uni and didn't want to be a researcher. So I found a job that was technical that didn't involve research, and that was GS1. I've worked at GS1 for over 20 years, but started in barcode scanning, so checking that the barcodes that were being produced by companies were the right height, the right size, included the right information. And back in 2014, in fact, I moved from GS1 Australia, where I was leading their healthcare work, to GS1 Global Office. I got to spend 6 years in Brussels, which was absolutely brilliant, and then moved back to Australia. But as part of the work that I started doing when I was in Global Office, it was working in the clinical trials sector and supporting the industry.
So you are directly working in the clinical trials, and your goal at GS1 is to create standards, am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we do. We're a not-for-profit standards organisation. Our job is simply to create standards based on the needs of industry, and our remit is very much about essentially the things that move through the supply chain. So how to identify products, locations, logistics units in the healthcare space, also how to identify recipients of care and care providers. So essentially how to identify a patient as a recipient of care and a care provider as a doctor or a nurse. How to capture those identifiers in barcodes, primarily in healthcare, although we do have standards for RFID, and then how to share that information in a standardized way. So essentially, we develop standards as industry tells us they need them. And that's the work that I've been doing with clinical trials. The industry came to us and said, hey, we would like to adapt the GS1 standards to meet the needs of the clinical trials sector. And so I've been working with many stakeholders from the sector since 2016 to do that.
And how do you find working in this industry, building standards? Are you facing, or have you been facing, any challenges along the way?
I think every industry that you work in has challenges, and before healthcare I worked in a range of industry sectors such as the timber industry or the plant growing industry, and clinical trials, yes, has challenges as well. From a GS1 perspective, I think if I can go to the positives first, the biggest positive for the clinical trial sector is that the industry wants to drive standards uptake because they see the benefit. The challenges are that there are so many stakeholders throughout the clinical trial sector who don't know about standards, they don't know about GS1, they don't know about what standards can actually do. Another challenge I would say is capability of IT systems, because GS1, we're not a solution provider. We don't sell barcode scanners or printers or anything like that. We don't sell IT systems. We develop the standards that help those things talk to each other and talk in the same way. So then for our standards to be implemented, we need IT systems to be capable. And so one of the biggest challenges in the clinical trials sector, where not a lot of people have heard of GS1 relative to the size of the sector, then we also need to provide education not only to industry stakeholders, but also to their IT providers to help them and help those stakeholders implement the standards. So IT capability is certainly and awareness is certainly a big challenge also.
Yeah, and you just mentioned stakeholders. So I'm thinking about the supply chain in clinical trials and how many people use a barcode, like all the different locations that kits stop by and where barcodes are read. So how do you get everyone in this supply chain involved in setting up standards?
That's a really good question. And so you're right in that lots of people in clinical trials today use barcodes, but they all use different barcodes with different meanings, with different information in them. So yes, how do you bring the industry together? In fact, for this project and for the work of GS1, it's actually been a couple of leaders in industry, one organisation coming out of France and another group of organisations coming out of the US that went to their GS1, their local GS1 member organisations, GS1 France and GS1 US, and essentially said, you know what, we would like to work on standards. And through industry driving this, they've actually brought together the other key stakeholders that they see throughout the sector that need to be aware. Now, of course, I'm talking about a group of maybe, let's say, 70 organisations, and of course the clinical trial sector is bigger than that, but it's those 70 organisations who are then implementing the standards themselves, who are making others, their peers, their IT providers, their partners aware of the standards, and through that, through experience, through word of mouth, through outcomes and benefits seen from implementation, it drives further and further, kind of like ripples in a pond across the industry. And that's something after what, nearly 6 years of work in this space, we're really starting to see happen.
That's so great to hear about an initiative like this, making people work together. There are so many areas where we work in silos, so it's very refreshing to actually hear that this initiative is bringing so many different organizations together to agree on standards.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, honestly, it's one of the pleasures in working in this sector. If you look at other parts of the healthcare industry, or if you look at other industry sectors, oftentimes a lot of the use of standards is either driven by a big buying organization. So you think about the grocery sector, it's the big retailers that have been behind a lot of the uptake of GS1 standards in that sector. If you think about the commercial healthcare sector, yes, there are absolute leaders in industry who are driving uptake of the standards, but there's also 75, I think, countries around the world who have requirements where GS1 standards are used, either regulatory requirements or trading partner requirements. But when you come to the clinical trial sector, it's truly industry wanting to do this for the benefit of their own industry and for ultimately the benefit of the patient, the subject in the clinical trials. And that's really kind of heartwarming and nice to see, and a pleasure to work with, to be honest.
Yeah, I totally get that. You mentioned the commercial side. Is there any, or are there any differences between how it's been released in the commercial side compared to the clinical trial space?
Well, in terms of the standards, in fact, because the commercial sector in healthcare has really got a lot of benefit out of using the standards, when the clinical trials representatives came to GS1, one of their real requirements was to align as much as possible with what the commercial sector is doing. So that was really interesting to see, and essentially in the standards that have been developed, particularly the identification and barcoding standard, is very, very almost they're super aligned. There's a couple of small differences that are particular to clinical trials, but very super aligned. In their data sharing standards, there are some some things in the clinical trials environment that are very specific to clinical trials. So we have to do something a little bit different for clinical trials. But yes, in terms of the standards and the way that the standards are developed and what industry has wanted, there's very much an objective to align and see the same benefits as the commercial sector. In terms of how the rollout of those standards is happening, as I said, it's really driven by industry leaders saying, and particularly sponsors who are saying, we want to do this because we know that this is going to help our supply chain, and we want to do this because we know it's going to help the trial sites. And you know, clinical trial supply chains are very precise. I'm telling you what you know. They're very precise. They're very particular. They're very controlled. So the idea that that the standards can add value to that, and that is seen by industry stakeholders, that's really empowering. I think the difference between that approach and what we see in some parts in the commercial sector is that the developments in the commercial sector were often regulatory first or trading partner requirements first that have driven suppliers to act. Not in every case, but in a good proportion of the cases, which is a little bit different from the approach from the clinical trial sector.
Okay, and yeah, it's because it comes from the industry leaders. I see.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So one last question for me, Tania. You've been involved in this project for 6 years, or nearly 6 years, you said. Where would you like to see it go? Where would you like to see it in 10 years' time, for example?
Where would I like to see it in 10 years' time? That's such a broad question. I think, first of all, let's take it from the patient perspective or the subject perspective. So imagine in 10 years' time, every subject in a clinical trial that either goes to a site and gets administered their drugs, collects their drugs from a site, or even gets them sent to their home, can either know that the care provider who's giving them those drugs, those investigational products, has scanned the barcode to be sure that the right thing is being dispensed to the right patient, or the subject who's receiving these items at home can have an app on their phone. They can scan the barcodes on those investigational products when they self-administer, potentially when they receive them for their own stock taking and inventory control of whatever inventory they keep within their location. And imagine that removes the paper. So if I go back then and talk from the perspective of the trial site, one of the things that I get told a lot from trial sites is that they're still managing things on paper. If I talk to wholesalers and distributors, particularly smaller ones who are working in the clinical trial environment, they're saying that they sometimes don't have awareness of what's being delivered to them and when. So they have to react when they receive items. So, and they're doing things perhaps manually. So if you think about where we could be in 10 years' time, from the patient, they're scanning the barcodes, they're confirming things. From the caregiver, they're scanning the barcodes, they're confirming the right items are being given to the right subjects. But also, communication is happening in a way, and data capture is happening in a way that paper is removed, manual processes are removed, proprietary approaches, so you have to do something special for this sponsor or something different for this sponsor in terms of communication, that kind of thing can be removed or minimized. That's what the standards are going to mean from a clinical trials perspective, and that's what I would like to see in 10 years' time. GS1 standards, if I'm really frank, GS1 standards aren't going to be the be-all and the end-all for the clinical trials environment, but what they are is a tool that can help to be sure that the right decisions are being made along the clinical trial supply chain, and anything that can be done to assist with that is highly important. And so that's what I would like to see in 10 years.
It sounds extremely promising, and I wasn't expecting that it could be so broad, the reach of barcodes, but it is really incredible when you think about it. So love that, absolutely love that, and I hope you're right that we'll see that in the next 10 years.
I hope so too, I really do. And I think we have within the sector people with a really strong vision who are very passionate about this work, and I think those people are going to be the ones that make the difference, the ones that drive the implementation. It's not my role to drive the implementation, it's my role to help the industry. So it's truly going to be industry doing this.
Well, we will do it, I'm sure. Well, thank you very much, Tania. It's been very nice talking to you. I hope a lot more people now know about this initiative of GS1 standards for barcodes in clinical trials. And we will all see you soon on Calyx Cafe. Thank you, Tania. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks so much for the chance to be here. You have a great rest of the day as well.
Thank you.